It's good that you put it in the context of somebody who doesn't have experience. They've never done this before. Because what I would recommend applies to them as much as it applies to everybody else.
I grew up in playing basketball. As we're talking about this, obviously, this is the fundamentals, right?
Yes.
Two things I think of. First, I think of Tim Duncan, Mr. Fundamental. Second, I think of the triple threat. This is like the thing, you catch the ball, there's three things you can do. You can dribble, you can pass, you can shoot.
Yep.
You do all those things from the triple threat, you holding the ball.
Yeah.
This is the mixing triple threat.
Okay, so we've been getting this question. I thought it'd be kind of fun to ask you and dive into this on the podcast today, Jeff. And sometimes these questions are not very fair. I know you've been asked this before, and it's like, what are three things to make me a better mixer? Or what are three things that I can do this weekend that make me, and it's just hard to simplify, but
Without context,
we're going to try to do our best, or please bear with us and try our hardest, or your hardest, because you're the subject matter expert here. But the idea of your beginner mixer walking up to a console for the first time, and you're like, I got to put together a mix, and I don't know much about EQ, don't know much about compression. There's these things that move up and down, these faders, these knobs, whatever. But I need to put together a mix. What are the first three things that I need to pay attention to and do the right way to set myself up for success to put together a quality mix?
Yeah. It's good that you put it in the context of somebody who doesn't have experience. They've never done this before. Because what I would recommend applies to them as much as it applies to everybody else. Because I do this as a seasoned mixer who's been doing this for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And I would advise everybody who steps up to a console to make sure that several things are up to snuff before you just start doing all these weird routings or acrobatic techniques or whatever.
Acrobatic techniques.
Well, jumping through hoops.
Yeah.
I think the very first thing, and I think it's part of the reason why it's at the top of the channel strip, is the gain knob.
Yeah.
I think you've got to start with gain. Got to start with gain structure. You've got to make sure that every input in your input list, everything across your console has sufficient input gain. Now, we can talk about things before the gain knob, like the source itself and whether the guitar's in tune and all that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about from the technical aspects of mixing.
Yeah.
Like assuming that your band knows what they're doing, assuming that everything's plugged in right, assuming that you're getting a signal. I think the gain and gain structure is the most important piece of any mix.
Yeah.
Because of the way the console responds, because of the way other things downstream of gain will be impacted by either too much or too little gain.
Yeah.
So I think for sure the gain knob is number one. And we can dig into that in a minute. Number two would be the high pass filter. And then number three would be the fader. And these are three very simple, seemingly simple things that with minimal training, somebody could get up to speed on.
Yeah.
And I think should be able to, if the right mic is in the right place or the DI that's plugged in is giving you a good signal, you should be able to create a decent mix with just proper gain, a good high-pass filter, and knowing how to manage faders.
Yeah.
I grew up in playing basketball, and so as we're talking about this, obviously this is the fundamentals, right?
Yes.
And when I think of basketball fundamentals, two things I think of. First, I think of Tim Duncan, Mr. Fundamental. Second, I think of the triple threat.
Yeah.
Right? This is like the thing, you catch the ball, there's three things you can do. You could dribble, you can pass, you can shoot.
Yep.
You do all those things from the triple threat, you holding the ball.
Yeah.
And this is the mixing triple threat. Like you get these three things down, and for me, I'm taking this in as very much so a beginner. I've been behind a console a couple times.
Yeah.
But it's most of the times it's been set up by
another person.
Another person.
Yeah. Running a show file.
Yep.
Which these things still apply in that,
they
that
totally
situation
do.
to some degree.
And
right?
so now I'm taking this on. I'm listening as the dummy, if it were. You're not a dummy if you're listening to this.
Nate, you're not a dummy.
You're right. I'm not a dummy,
You're
but
good enough. You're smart enough. And doggone it, people like you.
Well, yes. Okay, so no, and I think that's actually a great triple threat for the mixer. Maybe there's a video out there for us that we can creds to you, Nate. But okay, so
next
let's.
one will cost.
But that's
you.
a good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think you have the ball, and you've got options, right? So you're standing in front of the mixer. That's your ball.
Mm-hmm.
You've got options of what to do with it. And I think a lot of times people get going down this rabbit trail of, well, I got to find the right plug-in, or I've got to find the right routing, or I've got to make sure that I've got all these groups and buses going to parallel processing and all this stuff. And it's like, for somebody who doesn't even know what that is,
Yeah.
like if you're teaching somebody, especially if you've got a new volunteer and you're trying to bring them on board, your triple threat is gain, high pass filter, fader. And I think if you teach that properly, and if you know that properly, then you can easily understand, okay, now I need to move on to EQ.
Yeah.
I need to start to understand dynamics. I need to start to maybe understand plugins. But there are stepping stones. And I think, if you look at an old analog console and the schematics for that, the reason the electronics go from the actual preamp to gain, high pass filter, EQ, you work your way down the channel strip in a sequential way.
Yeah.
In large part because those are the order of priority.
Yeah. If you work backwards, you're making it way harder on yourself.
Oh yeah.
Totally.
And that's some people don't even consider gain. What's the difference between gain and volume?
Right.
And in some ways they're the same. We'll get into that in a second. But it's like they just go, oh, I'm going to put this fader up and it's distorted or it's just way too quiet. Why is it quieter than the rest of them? This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And for some of you, watching or listening out there, you might be like, oh, duh. But no, I mean, this is fundamental stuff so, okay, let's dive into gain first.
Yep.
You might not have a crystal clear definition for this, but I'm curious to know what your response is to folks if they go, what is gain?
Yeah.
What is that?
So basically it's a way to add voltage to a signal to be able to change the level,
Okay.
to add or attenuate, add or subtract voltage
Yeah.
to get more or less signal.
So it's almost manipulation to some degree of
Sort of,
signal
but
coming in.
It really is like it's a function of power. So
Okay.
it's at, sometimes with digital consoles, it's represented as trim.
Yeah.
Because you may not have a physical preamp. If it's coming over Dante or coming over, straight out of Ableton over a network into your console, it may just be a trim knob. But basically, the input gain, the gain knob is a way to level the input signal. So you see meters on your console, you see, the amount of input that's indicated by, LCD lights or an indication on your screen of this many dots of green, yellow, red. And then you see, red is like a clip indicator. So you don't want to be in the red and you don't want to be one dot of green. Like you need to basically level your inputs so that the console itself is receiving an adequate level from every instrument, every input along the input list. And so for me, I'm old enough to remember mixing on analog. And, with digital consoles and analog input, there's sort of a representation of how those levels relatively relate to each other. So on a digital console, minus 15 on your sort of meter is equivalent to analog 0. And so that is like that represents a robust input signal. You have headroom above that in case you have, like the transients of a snare drum or the peaks of an instrument might be higher than minus 15 or analog 0. So you have headroom to accommodate that. But you've got enough signal so that if you're sending that level to, let's say, a reverb or your monitor mixes or any kind of auxiliary bus, there's enough robust signal to be able to make those respond effectively. So that basically your signal is significantly higher than the noise that might be inherent in the signal. So your signal to noise ratio is high, but you have headroom to avoid clipping.
Yeah.
And you're not so low that when you turn up the fader, you're just turning up some of that noise floor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it really is like, for me, if I can get all of my inputs, in some consoles, labeling is different. Some say -12, some say -18, some say -15. But if you can find that sort of in between -12 and -18 on your metering, then you should be able to know that you have enough signal to, when you push that fader up, it's actually going to do something.
I mean, there's a lot of, I have heard a lot of a kind of standardization around gain. Do you think it just really depends on console manufacturer? I mean, you say -12, -18. We have a video on MXU about -12, -18 that Lee did.
Yeah.
That's really great. Go check it out if you want to hear more on that. But is there, in practicality for you, I mean, what are you doing?
Yeah,
Are you finding it till it feels right? Like,
no, I think especially as you're bringing on new volunteers,
yeah,
it's important for people to know, if I turn this knob so that the signal goes to this place, I can get a good result. So I really do think it's important to have a number that's your target. And so for us at my church, it's -18.
okay.
And because of the way the metering ballistics on our console work and the way fader resolution works, we found that -18 really kind of gets us to a good point as a starting point. So I think it may vary a little bit with your deployment, but I think it needs to be a specific number so that everybody knows, okay, I've turned this knob until the input signal gets to this point. And then as long as it's substantial enough that you have enough signal across the board that sends to monitors and sends to effects and all those things, and sends to your left-right bus, are responding in a way that you're avoiding clipping and that you're, getting a good signal.
Yeah.
Is there, and I know some consoles don't even have manuals, but if I were to open up a manual and look at the manual of a console, would it be like set gain to this, or this is just like?
There's probably not a guideline for that.
Okay.
And I don't know why that is. Like, most console manuals don't, they tell you what it does. They don't necessarily tell you how to do it.
Yeah.
They assume some level of knowledge in terms of, you probably know how to mix, you have this new desk. I think this really applies to like teaching people who don't know much. It's teaching a new volunteer.
We need to create like a cheat sheet.
That'd be good.
For each manufacturer.
Yeah.
Just like, hey, if you're on Yamaha,
there you go.
You go here. If you're Digico, you go here.
Yeah. Or, if you're a production leader and you're training volunteers, you should have a cheat sheet at front of house.
Yeah.
To basically say, okay, remember, guys, first step of rehearsal is doing a line check with everybody, making sure that because you might have a bass player whose rig is really hot, and you might need to gain down to get to that -18, -12, whatever you might have somebody, like we have one bass rig at our church where there's a significant difference. His output is just a lot lower than the other guys, and so I've always got to gain him up a little bit, which is fine. There's no right or wrong in terms of what position the gain knob needs to be. It's just where the input signal needs to land.
Yep.
So,
and is this every single time? You could have the same musicians. You are still going to make sure you touch the gain knob on every single channel strip every weekend, every time you step up to the desk?
So I mixed at my church this weekend.
Yeah.
We had a rehearsal Wednesday night and run-through/services on Sunday. So we set gain at rehearsal, and then we check it again on Sunday. Same players, same instruments, just to make sure that nothing, because you never know. Somebody might walk in and all of a sudden their 1/4-inch cable is different than it was the other night because they stepped on it or whatever. And so if there's a significant difference between one rehearsal and one service, or even between services, we're not going to check gain between services, but it's a good indicator of troubleshooting.
Yeah.
And
I mean, this is the thing too. Some people haven't connected these dots, so we'll connect them right now for you if you're one of those folks, and it's okay. But the gain is affecting everything you're doing down the line, like you mentioned earlier. So if you're like, well, it sounded fine last week, my compressor was dialed in, it's like everything is going to change.
Right.
Compression, bus sends. I mean, literally everything you do.
Yeah.
You're at the highest level. You are changing all the variables down the line with this one knob. And so that's why it's first on the list, right?
Yep.
It's like,
totally.
I mean, so I think that's super, super interesting. And just lastly, is what about for like, let's say you have input that is distorting and it's not gain. You gain it down all the way. Is that is there do you try to attenuate? Is there some consoles have gain and trim? Is it a source thing? Or what would you do in that situation?
I would start at the source at that point, because if your gain is all the way down and it's still clipping, I mean, most consoles have some sort of pad.
Yeah.
But I would definitely check the source to make sure that it's just not distorted from it depends what kind of distortion is what I'm getting at. Like if the signal's just crapped out because of something coming out of a computer or something through an interface or a DI or something like that, it might be a problem before it even gets to the console. So in terms of troubleshooting, if you plug it in and it's distorted or the gain is just super hot, first gain it all the way down, see if that takes it away. Maybe pad it if you have to. But yeah, if it's still distorted, it could be, for example, a wireless microphone is the transmitter is turned up too much at the mic and it's distorting the receiver. And that doesn't have anything to do with the console at that point.
Yeah.
It's within the communication between the RF mic and the receiver itself. And so there's, again, that's a gain structure too. There are ways to turn that mic signal up and down depending on how it's hitting the transmitter. Yeah. So, those are probably rare cases. I would hope that those are set up right. But for the most part, you can turn the gain up or down, but just being aware of the importance of just that nominal level.
The last thing on gain, I talked to somebody the other day, and they said they were pulling their hair out because their outputs, they were clipping. They were like, there's distortion, there remains, but like all of our input channels, totally fine. And they were, I can't remember what console they were on. I couldn't get exact to where they were running their gain to, but their gain was way too hot on every channel. And then it all summed to the left, right. And the left, right was like, we're getting way too much information.
Yep.
And again, video on, I think in that video that Lee did, it was -12, -18. And it was like at -12, we ran pink noise and did a whole math equation. And it was like, hey, just a couple dB of room on each of these channels makes a massive difference for the output.
Yeah.
And so you might be experiencing issues elsewhere on your desk. And you're like, I don't know how to fix this. It might just be gain. You just need to go back a few steps. So killer. Okay.
And that's why we landed at -18 for our scenario, is because just the way our console is getting to the amps, getting to the PA, it's like the overall structure needed to come down a little bit. Because at first I had said, we got this console. I was like, all right, -12.
Yeah.
And that it was too much when it got to the main output bus.
Yeah.
And so then we had to figure out a way to attenuate in other places. Didn't want to turn down the amps necessarily. We didn't want to have to just run the master fader super low. So it was just a management of, okay, how do these inputs get to the master bus? And so it's, but for our desk, even at -18, across the board, if we're there, then I know that it's in a good spot.
Yeah. Arguably probably the biggest thing that we feel is not being addressed out there is gain structure. That's something that is one of our most watched videos. All the videos we have on gain structure, it's seems to be a black box for some people.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will help. Okay, moving on to high pass filter.
Yep.
Is low pass filter included in that? Is
I
it
would say,
filtering?
filters. Yeah.
Filters. For all those out there who are confused, high pass filter, you are letting the highs pass.
Right.
So is the one on the bottom side. Sometimes that confuses people.
Yeah.
Low pass, you're letting the lows pass. So
it confused me for a while. I was like,
just think
is all the
opposite.
low end.
Yeah, it's it's opposite day.
So the high pass filter basically takes away, frequencies that are below the point at which you set that filter.
Yeah.
So old consoles used to just have a button. It was like 80 hertz or 100 hertz, and you'd push the button and it would filter everything below that frequency.
Yeah.
Nowadays, though, we have variable high-pass filters where we can go from 20 hertz, all the way up to some console manufacturers let you go all the way up.
For those snare bottoms out there.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, it's in my mind, it's sort of the first stage of tone shaping. It's the first stage of EQ. It's it's basically setting the point at which signal actually passes through the signal chain at a particular frequency. So for example, for a kick drum, you may not want to have a high pass filter because you want all the body and all the low end. Some you may want to filter from 20 to 30 hertz down, depending on the room, depending on what's happening. But things like a snare drum, a vocal, acoustic guitar, hi-hat, cymbals, most of the other inputs in your show file.
Any live mic, certainly.
Any live mic, you're going to need to have a high-pass filter. Now, some people think it's just a set and forget thing like the old days where, okay, everything's just filtered at 100 hertz and we move on. But finding the sweet spot of a high-pass filter can be really important. If you're listening to a vocal and you raise the high-pass filter to a point where the vocal starts to sound thin, starts to lose some body, starts to lose any of its resonance, that's the point at which you'll find a sweet spot. Before you even go to EQ, it's like there's this, oh, that's too much. Oh, that's not enough. Okay, that's good. And for some singers, that might be 180 hertz. Some singers, that might be 300 hertz. It just depends on the person, depends on the input. But I would apply this to, guitars, vocals, keys, really any of the other inputs besides maybe kick drum. I would even use a high-pass filter many times on a bass guitar. So just people don't spend enough time dialing in a high-pass filter is my point. Yeah. Because I think in terms of tonality, you can really find some subtleties with where your high-pass filter lands. So for a volunteer who doesn't really understand much about EQ yet, they can use a high-pass filter to really affect the tonality of their inputs.
Yeah.
And so, part of it is you need to know what a good X input should sound like. So that's some listening, that's some education. But if anything sounds particularly muddy, if you find lack of clarity from an instrument, just messing with a high-pass filter and what that frequency point is at which the signals are dumped from the low end is going to be a good first step.
When you mentioned this earlier, backing up, some people ask, what's a safe starting point? Let's just go back to the olden days where it was 80 hertz.
Yeah.
80 or between 80, 120, somewhere in that range. If you find that everything is up, just to be specific, like if everything is up at like 250, probably something going on with your PA.
Yeah. You've probably got an issue with the way your subs are deployed or the way your PA is responding to the console itself. Maybe there's some master EQ that's happening in your processor that's wonky. Yeah.
Or you're in a youth room with the subs just cranked.
Just going to 11.
Which, maybe in that case it's appropriate.
I've been there before.
Yeah. I think it would have to be a consistent trend across all your channels, right? There are some instruments that require, or vocals, that you got to take it all the way up that far. And it's kind of back to the, hey, if it sounds good, turn it till it sounds good.
Yeah.
But if that's happening everywhere, then you probably got something down the line you got to address.
But I think the point is turn it.
Yeah.
Like it's too easy just to sort of set everything at 100 hertz and forget it. It's like, well, maybe this piano, especially if you have an acoustic piano, the left hand of the piano with the sound of the PA getting, you might have low end feedback in those piano mics, and a high pass filter might have to be set completely differently than your electronic keyboard.
Yeah.
So just don't be afraid to get in there and really listen.
Yeah.
And listen, with the idea that, in fact, even for a seasoned mixer, it might be fun to turn everything off except that. No plugins, no EQ, no nothing, and just see how good a mix you can make with just a high pass filter.
Yeah. Yeah. And quick tip for y'all out there, make sure it's engaged. Because sometimes
you have to turn it on.
Sometimes console manufacturers, it's like, if you don't notice, it's like it's slightly grayed, but you can still see it. And it moves around, and then you realize, oh, it's not in. And there's, usually there's
there's an on button.
There's an on button or an in or something. And some of you might out there be like, yeah, the high pass filter sucks. It doesn't do anything for me.
Turn it on.
Just turn it on first. So
I'm moving it, but nothing's changing.
Nothing's changing. And low pass, again, it's kind of a secondary. You're going to use it less frequently, but same.
But it's a great way. It's a great way to mitigate high frequency feedback.
Yeah.
If you don't know anything about EQ, and your vocals are feeding back, put the low pass filter in and take it down to like 6K.
And if you're in, again, some consoles, that low pass is actually the fourth band in your EQ. Yeah. And you just got to, switch the setting of it and you can bring it down.
Yeah.
Often, it seems like consoles nowadays have designated high pass. Sometimes they have designated low pass. Sometimes it's built into the EQ, the top band. So both critically important. High pass is more really critically important. Anyways, okay. This one seems like the obvious one, but I'm excited for it. The fader.
Yeah.
So many people think, yeah, duh, it's just, faders, volume, but unpack that a little bit.
Well, your fader is kind of be careful how I say this. I think it's kind of the last step in your gain stage.
Okay.
Because it is gain in a way, in that it is the volume of your signal getting to other buses, getting to the PA. For our simplistic example's sake, I'll just say it's the way your sound gets to the PA.
Yeah.
And so, but there is something to that fader position, fader resolution. All those things are important. So when we talk about gain structure, the gain knob is getting the input to the channel strip, and then the fader is how it gets to the PA.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people just have sort of especially beginner mixers, have kind of a set and forget mentality when it comes to faders. Yeah. Like I turn it up, I can hear it. I'm just going to leave it there. It's like, okay, but, I think to your basketball analogy, I feel like the console is my instrument and I want to play it. And so because we have our gain structure set right, because we have our filters set so that it's musical, every input kind of sounds like it should, the fader is our opportunity to actually make music, right? It's like there's a technical aspect to all this, but then there's also the nuance of helping to communicate what the band is trying to do, right? They're playing a song, so there are things that are happening during the song that I need to pay attention to. Maybe there's a guitar lick that sets up the intro, or the turnaround between the first chorus and the second verse. Or maybe there's a change in the song from when the piano is driving the bus to when the guitar is driving the bus. It's like I want to be aware of those things musically, and the faders are my way of being able to communicate to the audience, here's what the band's doing.
Yeah.
So I think if we simplify the whole thing, like if we think in terms of gain, high-pass filter, fader, for a volunteer especially, now the volunteer gets to really feel some nuance in what these faders can do.
Yeah.
And so I would say don't be afraid to play your instrument, right? If you're intimidated that you're going to do something wrong or mess something up, this is part of where you learn that some of this stuff is kind of hard to break.
Yeah.
It's it's a good exercise, especially for a beginner, to feel like they're able to kind of follow the music and the arc of the song and make some nuanced changes that are going to have impact.
Yeah.
So before you go into complicated, just routing and plugins and other things, it's like, let's make sure we can make the song come to life with just a fader.
Yeah. So let's fader resolution. You've said that a few times. What is fader resolution, first of all?
Okay.
Let's unpack some of that.
Yeah. So the distance between the fader in a bottom sort of off position and all the way up is not a linear curve. It's a logarithmic expression. So what that means, like if you look at the meters on your fader, the very bottom may have an infinity symbol or like a minus 60, or it's a very low level. And then you've got, the distance between minus 60 and minus 50 might be a quarter of an inch.
Yeah.
And then minus 50 to minus 40 is a little smaller than that. And by the time you get up to minus 10 to minus 5, it's a logarithmic curve. So the distance that the fader travels to, say, make a 5 dB change is going to be, when you're at 0, it might be a pretty sizable fader throw to get 5 dB.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the fader, 5 dB is a tiny change.
Yep.
So when I say fader resolution, I want to have my gain structure and my output structure set up so that all of my faders can be about 0 and I still have room to play.
Yeah.
Versus if your faders are down at like minus 30, you want to make a small change in volume, you've got to make a tiny fader move in order to make that happen.
Yep.
So I want my faders to be able to live between minus 5 and 0 and plus 5 so that I can make some changes and it's not making dramatic changes to the volume.
Yeah. I always, when I think of fader resolution, I think of a microscope, or for me personally, like a hunting scope. Your rehearsal is like, or setting up your show file, you want to get your coarse adjustment set.
Yeah.
So you have coarse adjustment and fine adjustment, right? You make fine adjustments up, as you're describing, around unity, but coarse adjustments are down here where it's like you're just trying to get in the right universe of volume. But when you're mixing, you want to make fine adjustments. You don't want to make coarse adjustments.
Right.
And so how does somebody approach, say they get their gain structure set properly, everything's looking good, but they are at minus 35 on the fader.
Yeah.
Which is coarse adjustment, right? Area on the fader. How do they change that? How do they get their faders into that fine adjustment unity range?
Yeah. So you're going to have to attenuate somewhere.
Okay.
In other words, you're going to have to turn it down somewhere. So either that's, through a DCA, maybe if you don't know, a DCA is just a remote control fader for a bunch of other faders. So maybe you have an all band DCA that lives at minus 10 so that you can turn those band faders up 10 dB.
Yeah.
Or you attenuate it at the master fader.
Yeah.
Or you turn down the amps themselves.
Yeah.
But I think there has to be a way to have healthy gain structure, healthy fader resolution, and good output level.
Yeah.
And so it could be, if you find yourself where you have it's just so loud, even with your faders up a little bit, I think that's where people who have problems with gain structure, that's kind of where it starts.
Then they turn down the gain.
They have to turn the gain down so much to get their faders up to feel comfortable mixing, but then they don't have enough level to really make a difference in their inner mixes or their auxes or other places where those levels need to go to. So at that point, I would say you need to assess your PA deployment, your amps. It's a system problem at that point.
Yeah.
Because theoretically, I should be able to have whatever my target number is. Let's say minus 18 on my input level with my fader at 0, and everything sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and the whole goal is, you can get gain structure set, put every fader up to 0, and you got a decent baseline mix.
Yeah.
And I would do this back in the day. The LS9, actually, we would do this because I think Yamaha still has this on their desk where they have attenuation in the EQ per channel, which you have to be careful because it affects stuff down the line. But literally, we would just attenuate every channel till everything was at 0, and the mix sounded great. You bring everything up to 0, and then we tell volunteers, all you need to do is set your gain structure and then put the fader at 0, and you're starting with a decent mix.
Yeah.
And then now you're bringing art into it and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because as the newbie here and you asked that question, I immediately go, oh, well, then something's wrong with your gain structure. So then I would have gone back to gain structure when clearly that's not the issue. So
and
something worth
oftentimes
clarifying.
You could just turn down a lot of people who run up against this issue, they might be a set up tear down church and they've got point source speakers on sticks, and most point source speakers have those knobs on the back.
Just turn down the
Turned out it's
turn down the
like
speaker
some sort
volume.
of gain knob on your speaker.
Yeah.
Turn it down. Maybe it got moved during load in, load out, or whatever it might have
Yeah.
been.
because I think especially now that most of us are doing mixing to online, mixing to broadcast, gain structure that's robust enough to be able to have a significant level. You know, if you're just turning your gain knobs down to make your PA sound okay, it might be that your broadcast mix is suffering
Yeah.
because of lack of solid gain structure. So again, the broadcast mix side makes the gain knob even more significant in terms of the importance of its role. So, and again, this is before we talk about EQ, before we talk about compression, before we talk about plugins. This episode really has just been designed to go, okay, what are the big three? Like, what's the triple threat when you've got the ball? I love that. And I think if we can, especially if we lead volunteers, we can't talk enough about gain structure.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
We when we were in the fader talking about faders, we ended up talking about gain again.
I know.
It's like one big circle. Gain is so important.
Yeah. Well, and you know, the fader is an aspect of gain.
Yeah.
You know, the function of it is.
There's gonna be some nerds out there, correct?
Well, there's gonna be some nerds out there who don't like any of this. But I think you know, instead of trying to point out what I or we got wrong, I would say just take this under the umbrella of general best practices, especially if you're leading new volunteers. You cannot overemphasize gain enough.
Yeah.
And especially as they learn, it's like, okay, high pass filter is an aspect of tone shaping. What else you got?
Yeah.
Well, you know, we can talk about EQ.
Yeah.
We can talk about where the high pass filter meets the low frequency of the EQ and how that's such a big deal. But for somebody who doesn't know anything, I don't want to overwhelm them with a 4-band parametric EQ and all of its capabilities.
Yeah.
I want to start with, okay, you hear how the sound changes as I move this up and down?
Yeah.
Like somebody's playing the bass guitar and I engage the high pass filter and I take it from 30 to 50 to 60 to 80. Can you hear how that thins out the sound of the bass guitar? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's find the spot where we still hear the body of the bass, but we don't hear too much low rumble.
Yeah.
That's a simple way to start them on a path of, okay, I'm starting to understand EQ and tonality and tone shaping. Yeah. With the faders, it's like, okay, can you just put your finger on the lead vocal and throughout the course of this rehearsal, make sure that I can always hear the lead vocal.
Yeah.
And they can just practice with level up and down, level up and down, level up and down.
Yeah.
All the other faders might be just set and forget, but they've got this one fader.
Yeah.
And then, hey, after this transition, let's do the same thing to pastor's mic.
Yeah.
Make sure I can always hear that one fader.
Yeah.
You know, and then as they grow, as they develop, and even if you're a seasoned mixer, it's good to kind of unravel some of what you think you know and start from a baseline again. You know, go back to the basics.
Yeah.
We always used to say that, you know, every year of first day of training camp for the Packers, Vince Lombardi would say to his team, this is a football. It's like these guys are professionals in the NFL, and he has to remind them about the very basic thing. Your job is to get this thing over that line at the end of the field.
Yeah, that's great. Man, this is so good. We need a course on the audio triple threat.
I like it.
Coming to MXU. Maybe let us know in the comments if you want a course on the audio triple threat. That'd be fun. Thanks, Jeff. I feel like this has just been like a day of gaining wisdom from you.
Just, you know, sit at the feet of Uncle Jeff.
I know.
You never know what you're going to learn.
Uncle Jeff. Oh, man.
I learned a few things.
Yeah,
so.
This is good stuff. This is really important stuff. I guess we're going to find out if people like it or not. But yeah, we're
well, and it's one of those things where, like it or not, you need to do it.
Yeah.
This is kind of like eating your vitamins. It's like, yeah, it's not as fun as cotton candy. That's where plugins come in. We're not there yet. We're talking about the things that get you to a healthy place that you can actually use those other tools.
Yeah. So good. Well, to all those of you watching and listening, thanks so much. We will see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.